Keeping your bolts tight is always a challenge. There are two super interesting designs that I want to explore and see if they offer any advantage. Nordlock washers and Fugi-Nuts. On this channel, we look at the science behind our grown-up toys. I had been aware of Nordlock washers for some time, but it was during my interview with Dave Cape that he mentioned he uses 3mm Nordlock washers with great success. Now, I've always been a little skeptical that Nordlock washers actually work, and here's why. So here's a Nordlock washer. They're always two washers stacked on top of each other. They have these serrations on the outside, top and bottom. Then they have these ramps in between them. The concept is this. If the bolt wants to unwind, what happens is the bolt takes this washer with it, and this washer stays in place, and these two washers separate, and these ramps lift up, pushing the washers apart and creating more tension top to bottom. And that's what keeps the bolt from backing out, is this increased tension from the ramps separating. The part that I want to investigate is, in order for this to work, you have to have more friction on these two surfaces. You have to have more friction between the bolt and the top washer than these ramps. Likewise, down here, you have to have more friction between the lower washer and whatever you're bolted against. If you have less friction at either of these two surfaces than the friction from the ramps, then your bolt head will just slip, or the washers will just slip. The ramps won't be engaged. So I'm very curious to see if the ramps do in fact act as they are, or if there's some slippage at either of these two interfaces. I am more than happy to be proven wrong. I have to imagine that the engineers at Nordlock did their due diligence. I'm going to measure some and then we'll know. The other design is called a Fugi-Nut. Imagine a nylock insert nut. This is a nut with a plastic ring on the inside that creates friction against the bolt. Well, a Fugi-Nut uses a steel ring instead of plastic, so it's far more durable. In fact, nylock nuts are really only good for 3 or 4 installations. After that, the nylon has crept, it actually cold flows and becomes looser over time, and with multiple installations. The steel Fugi-Nuts attempt to solve that. In addition to Nordlock and Fugi-Nuts, I'm going to test a few other designs and all 3 strengths of Loctite and see who comes out on top. Let's check it out. So I've got all different types of nuts here, and I tighten them all down. I'll go through what each one of these is real quick. Part of the key to evaluating each of these back to back is that they need to be in the same environment. So these were all tightened at the same time. They were all tightened to exactly 4 Newton meters, and they're all on the same piece of wood, and they have the same steel washers underneath. So the spring rate of the substrate should be equal between all of them. The friction between the nut and the washer should be the same between all of them. So we should be able to get very reliable results. When you're measuring the torque on a fastener, what you're trying to do is measure the amount of tension in the bolt. How much force is pulling this bolt? And as you add torque, it adds more and more tension trying to pull this bolt apart. So part of a torque rating is how tight should this be before the bolt head breaks, before the bolt breaks. And when you look up the torque for a certain fastener, it's going to be under a prescribed condition. You know, it might be a dry bolt, it might be a black oxide bolt, it might be a chrome plated bolt, it might be stainless on stainless. It could be any variation. So for my test, I'm using the exact same fasteners, the exact same washers, no grease. Everything has the same nuts, same bolts, same washers underneath the bolt heads. So all of my torque specs should produce the same tension in the bolt. This is a fresh nylock washer, and I'm going to tighten them right before I do the test so that I know the nylon insert hasn't been deformed. So I'm going to tighten these two right at the last minute. All the rest of them have been tight for a couple of days. I did that so that the ones with Loctite, this is purple, blue, red Loctite, 3 of each. I did that so that the Loctite would have time to cure. Anytime you're using Loctite or epoxy or even paint, it takes a couple days for it to reach full cure. All those things I mentioned will be dry in 5, 10, 20 minutes, and you can use them, but they don't reach full strength for 24 to 48 hours. So when you're painting a body, it may feel dry in 5 minutes, but it's really not hardened and cured until a couple days later. So I'll show you what I did to all these fasteners. I've got this screwdriver here, and I've got the torque set to 4 Newton meters. That's just that's the audio limit. So what I did previously to all these fasteners was tighten it very carefully. So as it gets tight, it'll start to make noise as it reaches 400. I should say 4. So I stopped right when I got to 4, as close as I could. That's about as accurately as you can use the tool. Anytime you're measuring something like we're doing here, you want to take into account statistics. So I'm going to measure 2 of every bolt, and I did 3 of the Loctites just because. And really, I probably should do 10 or 20 if I really wanted to have scientific rigor, but we're going to do 2 and see where it gets us. There's always 2 sources of error anytime you're taking a measurement. One is the operator's ability to use the tool, and second, it's the tool's ability to measure. So there is a tolerance for error in the tool, and there's a tolerance in my hand. And together that's a study called gauge R&R, repeatability and reproducibility. One is the operator's ability to measure, and one is the tool's ability to measure. And again, we're going to be as scientific as possible within reason. I'm just going to measure 2 of each and see if that starts to give us an indication of which one's better. So what I have here is, this is just a regular nut, stainless steel, nothing fancy. Then in the second position, I have a split washer. These split washers, what they do is they're bent apart, and it kind of gives a little bit of a spring, so it pushes against the nut and bolt and adds a little bit more preload to it. These aren't super effective. They don't really add that much tension. They are good in a high vibration situation where your bolt may be loosening and tightening a lot, but these are cheap and not generally considered super effective. Then in position number 3, I've got a flange nut. These have a big serrated surface on it. So the idea is that you're grabbing more surface area and these serrations dig into the surface. Now, I don't know how well that I can dig into this steel washer they're against. It might be better on wood or a different material underneath, but we'll see if it makes any difference. Then in the next position, I have brand new Nylock nuts. These have a nylon ring on the inside that is smaller than the threads, and the threads push into it. It kind of grips against the threads. The problem with these is that plastic over time cold flows or creeps, and it takes a set. And so they lose effectiveness over time. If you take a look at any phone charging cable, you'll see these bends. You can pretty much never get these bends out. That's because this thing sat for months on the shelf, on the ship, on the way from the factory, and this plastic cold flowed. It crept. That is an engineering term, creep. So this plastic crept, and now it's permanently got these bends in it. And these will never come out unless you really try hard to straighten it out. So this kind of creep in plastic is exactly what happens to Nylock nuts. Eventually that plastic creeps and it's no longer tight. Especially if you put it off and on multiple times, it stretches out those threads. So what I have is, in this position, I have brand new fresh Nylock nuts. And in this position, I have 2 nuts that have been on my RC car, on the axle nuts, that have been there for off and on for months. So these, if they were going to get stretched out, these should be nice and loose and stretched out. So fresh ones, old ones. Then I've got the Nordlock washer. These are really interesting. You can maybe see in between, they have these ramps, and these ramps tighten against each other. If the washers want to turn, those ramps push it apart and create more tension. Notice also that they have serrations on both sides. That's important to notice because these serrations are supposed to grab into the material next to it and keep that from slipping. What makes me suspicious about Nord-Lock washers is you have to have more friction on the nut side and on the base side in order for this middle ramps to slip. If you have less friction here and here, then the washer isn't going to do anything. So we'll see if these make a difference. And then these are the Fugi-Nuts. As you can see, the Fugi-Nut, instead of a nylon ring, it's got a metal washer. And that metal doesn't deform. It flexes out of the way, but it springs back. It's like having a spring in there. Steel makes for great springs because it springs back. So this should be usable many, many times without stretching out the metal like the plastic would on a nylon. All right, so what I'm going to do is loosen each one of these. And as we loosen them, what we're really measuring is the breakaway friction. How much friction does it take for it to release and start to turn? We're not really measuring bolt torque when we're undoing it. We're measuring the friction to resist loosening, which is a little bit different. So I'm going to set this to peak, and it's going to record the peak of each one I do. Now, another thing is you want to go really slowly. If you just pop it, you're going to get a much higher reading than if you do it slowly. So I'm going to do each one of these slowly and record the results. So what's really interesting so far is that the torque on all of these seems much, much lower than the original torque that I put on. I put on 4 Newton meters, and almost all of these are loosening with 1.5 to 2 Newton meters. With the exception of the brand new Nylocks, those are almost 3. Now, I tightened them to 4. It only takes 3 to loosen them. I suspect that what may be happening over time is that this wood is compressing. Remember we were talking about creep earlier? I think this particle board may be creeping over time, and the torque is actually a little bit looser than it was when I started. But the results should be fine because all of them have crept at the same amount, except for the ones that I just tightened. So we may have to disregard these 2 data points because they were tightened fresh today, and all the rest of them have crept over a couple of days. Now we're about to get to the good ones. This is the Nord-Lock, and this is the Fugi-Nut. What's interesting is one of these Nord-Locks was only 1.5, which is not any better than the baseline, and another one was 2.4. So the results are quite different between these two. That means I need to go back and do a whole lot more to get a better statistical picture of what their true performance is. But let's try the Fugi-Nuts. Okay, now we're going to do 3 Loctites. Purple, which is the least strong, blue, which is the intermediate, and red, which is the strongest. And I'm going to do 3 each. So far, this purple Loctite has killed everything before it. Now let's try the blue Loctite 3 times. All right, I'm going to try one more experiment. I'm going to go back and retighten all of these and loosen them again fresh, right behind each other. So we're eliminating any creep from the wood that might be there. I can't redo the Loctite because the Loctite is now broken and it's no longer providing the bond that it did. So I'm going to rule these out, but I'm going to retighten all of these and loosen them one more time. And we'll get a second set of data. Okay, now I'm going to go back and loosen them all now that I have a fresh torque. There's definitely quite a bit of difference between tightening them a couple days ago and tightening them today. Interesting. What was that snap? Whoa, check that out. I can actually see the ramp starting to open up. Not sure if you can see that, but look how those washers are definitely turning and starting to push against each other. And at a certain point, the ramps jumped to the next tooth. Wow, that's unexpected. Interesting. This one's starting to open up again. Interesting. And it gives up the ghost about 4.1. Interesting. I'm going to try this one again because I have a theory what happened here. Yeah, it gets less and less torque each time. Interesting. I'll save my thoughts till the end. Now the Fugi-Nuts. Last one. I think that moved. All right, 3.5. So I've got them all measured. Let me go put the data in a table and a graph, and we'll take a closer look at it. Here's all the data that was bolted to the wood and sat for 3 days. On the left here, we have the standard nut. This is our baseline. Then we have the split washer and the flange nut and the nylock washers. Then in the middle here, we have the Nordlock washer and the Fugi-Nut, and then Loctite over here to the right. Now remember, this nylock nut, the new version that had never been used, was installed immediately and did not sit for the 3 days. So this data point is an outlier, and I think we'll eliminate that because it's not helping paint an accurate picture. So here we have the split washer was a little bit worse, and the flange nut was a little bit better. And the used nylock was still offering some advantage. The Nordlock and Fugi-Nut were definitely offering an advantage over the standard nut, but look at this Loctite. This was offering a huge advantage. Purple Loctite is the low strength version, blue is the mid strength version, and red is the strongest Loctite version. And that's not represented perfectly here, so there's a little bit of discrepancy in the accuracy of the data. Red is the strongest, but purple shouldn't be right here. So I think this discrepancy falls within experimental error. I wasn't super careful how much Loctite I applied and the conditions under which I applied that Loctite. So we really shouldn't make firm conclusions over the relative strength of these Loctites, but we can conclude that it does offer a huge advantage over the baseline nut. Here now is the data that was from the fasteners that were immediately tightened and then loosened right after that. They did not sit for 3 days. They maybe sat for 3 minutes. The Loctite, I think we should eliminate from this data set because the wood underneath this had relaxed, and this torque reading isn't under the same conditions as these readings. So let's just eliminate Loctite from this study. Here we have the split washer, once again, lower than the standard nut, the flange nut a little bit higher, and what's a little confusing is the nylock nuts. The new one and the used one Both measure about the same level, and it's about the same level as standard nut. So to me, these two data points are a little suspect, and we should probably revisit them. The Nordlock and Fugi-Nut both are considerably better than the standard nut. Now, if you remember the first test, the Nordlock and Fugi-Nut both were equal. So I think this discrepancy comes from experimental error, and I don't think we can quite conclude exactly which one is better. Now let's take a quick look at all the data points together. This front row is the data points that sat for 3 days and the wood compressed, and the back row is the data that was measured immediately. Now, what trends can we see? The split washer is worse in both cases. The flange nut is a little bit better in both cases. The nylock washers are still inconclusive to me. The Nordlock and Fugi-Nuts are both better than the baseline in both instances, and Loctite seems to offer a big advantage over the baseline standard nut. But we don't know how this compares to a Nordlock and Fugi-Nut under the same conditions. So there were some inaccuracies with the test setup, but we can almost certainly conclude that both Nordlock washers and Fugi-Nuts offer noticeably higher retention. But we can't yet say which one offers the highest retention. Part of the reason is because the wood backing was relatively soft. The Nordlock washers were actually opening up, compressing the wood, and the washers were skipping over the teeth. This means we didn't really measure the maximum resistance. But the washers were sliding as designed, contrary to what I had predicted at the beginning of the video. We can also conclude that all versions of Loctite offer a big advantage. Because I wasn't super careful with the amount of Loctite I applied, the exact result of each type of Loctite was masked under experimental error and user error. What we don't know is how Loctite compares to Nordlock or Fugi-Nuts because the tests were under different conditions. So while we do have some general trends, a more precise test, bolted against rigid steel instead of wood, would be the next step. For now, I'm persuaded enough that I'm going to start using Fugi-Nuts and Nordlock washers, which was my original curiosity, and I might even use them both together. But I still want to know which one is better, so subscribe and turn on notifications so you'll know when I publish an update.